Jerry Bovino. We're back with the Middle East update. We've got Carolyn Glick, the deputy managing editor of the Jerusalem Post and the senior fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. Carolyn, as opposed to the rest of us, actually knows something about her topic. Carolyn, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're happy to have you. Carolyn is also the author of the book that you can get on Amazon called Shackled Warrior. And how would you describe this book to our viewers, Carolyn?
Well, it's sort of chapter by chapter description of all of the different problems that Israel faces and Israel's role in the world, and with kind of explanation of Israel and the nations and what's happening inside of Israel. So it's sort of a compendium of everything you needed to know about Israel, but we're afraid to ask.
Okay, now the most important question we should start with is, what's a nice Jewish girl like you doing in a place like this?
Well, I'm having a family vacation, but that's courtesy of a wonderful conference that's going to be taking place on Thursday at the Aspen Institute that I was invited to speak at. So I'm here for a conference and using it as a way to have a wonderful vacation.
And Alan Altman, we want to thank him for setting up this interview today. It's really nice at this time of year in Aspen where we can have people who actually are experts on their subject. And at the same conference, we're going to have James Woolsey, yep, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and also John Bolton, the former United States ambassador to the UN. So, I mean, we've got some. You're in there with some heavy firepower, Carolyn. Can you hold your own?
I think so.
Yeah, you're not.
I think so, and they're very good men and gentlemen, so they'll make sure to ensure that I'm holding my fire.
I actually had a chance to speak with both of them last year at a similar conference, and it was great. You know, you see these people who are actually pulling the strings and controlling what happens in the world, and then you meet them and just nice guys. And
wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah. So, okay, let's just give our viewers, because they don't know you, and where are you living? What's your background? How did you get involved in Middle Eastern politics? Give them a little overview.
Well, I grew up in Chicago, and I made Aliyah, or immigrated to Israel, about 20 years ago.
Okay, Aliyah defines the first time that a Jewish person goes to Israel.
It's a Hebrew word that means going up, and so a Jew has an aliyah when he reads from the Torah in the synagogue, and it also is when a Jew alights to the land of Israel. So Jewish immigration to Israel is called aliyah, and I made it you make it, and I made it in 1991, and I've been living in Israel. I served for many years in the Israel Defense Forces and the Israeli Army, and
even though you weren't a native-born Israeli.
Right, exactly.
How does that work? You don't have to be native-born to serve in the armed forces.
No, you don't. And so I joined when I was 21, and I served about 6 years. I left as a captain, Captain Carolyn.
A captain of military intelligence, the classic oxymoron. What were you doing?
Well, actually, I was a member of Israel's negotiating team with the Palestinians. I coordinated all the negotiations on civilian affairs. So I was in the negotiations. I was a negotiator for Israel from 94 to 96 at the height of the
Well, give us an example of
years.
one thing that you negotiated so our viewers can understand. What do you negotiate?
Well, Israel was in charge of all of the governing affairs, basically, of Judea and Samaria, or what's commonly known as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, from 1967 until 1994. And so when you're starting a new authority, like the Palestinian Authority, you have to negotiate the transfer of all of these different governmental offices. How are they going to operate them? What's going to happen? So, for instance, everything from the education department to health to planning and zoning, gas, electric, everything that makes up the governance of a town, of a city, of an area are things that have to be negotiated to be transferred from Israel to the PLO. So, you know, for instance, what kind of gas tankers could be used, and how do you ensure that flammable material is going to be possibly...
But how did you know what would be the correct, in this example, number of gas tankers? Did you have advisors?
Oh, yes. I mean, the military carried out these negotiations hand in hand with all the governmental ministries in Israel. So for issues like education, you had the education ministry involved. For issues like gas and electric, you had the electric company and the electric authority, or the gas authority of Israel involved, so that you had professionals who were part and parcel of this whole negotiating
And if you
process.
were still involved in your old job as a captain in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, would
you
have the chance to negotiate the release of Sergeant Gilad Shalit, who's held in Lebanon now?
No, Gilad is held in Gaza by Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, and he's a hostage. He's not.
Wasn't he captured in Lebanon?
No, those were two other IDF reservists, actually, who were kidnapped from Israel and spirited into Lebanon and murdered. And their bodies were held by Hezbollah for 3 years until Israel released terrorists from prison in exchange for their bodies. And Gilad Shalit is, we hope, still alive in Gaza, but he's a hostage, and they're trying to force Israel to give 1,000 terrorists who have been sentenced to prolonged prison terms in Israel and free them in exchange for Gilad Shalit.
And isn't that in some way a dramatic representation of what one life means to Israelis, that they would trade thousands of terrorists for one Israeli soldier?
Yes, and it's also, I think, I don't support these swaps because I think that, we've had hundreds of Israelis who have been murdered by terrorists who Israel freed in previous hostage swaps. So I think that one life is worth an entire world, and that goes double for the Israelis whose names we don't know yet because they haven't yet been murdered, but will be if we free 1,000 terrorists for Gilad Shalit.
Okay, so where'd you go to school?
I went to undergrad at Columbia University, and then I went to Israel right after that, and I came back 7 years later, and I went to grad school at the Kennedy School at Harvard.
Okay, you know what I say, you can always tell a Harvard man, but you can't tell him much. So, okay.
You didn't know about Harvard women, then,
No,
right?
Harvard women, it's not in my repertoire. Let's do this. Let's take a short break to recognize the underwriters who very generously support us here at Grassroots Television. When we come back, I'm going to ask Carolyn, an expert on Middle East policy, to tell us the one thing that she wishes Israel would do better. And so first we're going to thank Macklowe Galleries in New York City. If you're in New York, stop by on Madison Avenue right across from Barney's and 61st Street. Say hello to Larry and say hello to Ben. They've got some beautiful jewelry and Tiffany lamps. Bishop Plumbing, Heating, and Air Conditioning right here in Aspen. Bovino Law Firm, David Bovino and Summer Woodson, litigation and real estate and trusts and wills. MS Rao Antiques down in New Orleans at www.rowantiques.com. Tasha, the love coach. We want to give Tasha a plug. Tasha will help you find the love that you want and deserve, and it's www.tashathelovecoach.com. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to find out the one thing that Carolyn says Israel needs to do better right now. We'll come right back. Jerry Bovino, we're back with the Middle East Update. Carolyn B. Glick, what's the B stand for?
Beth.
Beth, and she's the author of Shackled Warrior. You can get it on Amazon. It's a compendium, a good word, a College Board word, about what's going on in the Middle East right now, and it's a great read. And we are going to talk right now about the one thing that Israel needs to do better right now.
I think the main thing that Israel needs to do is stop apologizing already. I think that, for too long, Israel is under massive assault from sort of a mixture of different forces. And instead of just explaining forthright why it is that Israel has to do the things that it does, we find over and over and over again Israel's official spokespeople keep saying, we're sorry, we're sorry, we're sorry. And we don't really have anything to be sorry about, I don't think. And I think that the worst thing that you can do is apologize for something that you're not to blame for. And that's really something that I would like Israel's leaders, Israel's spokespeople to just, I could just give them one piece of advice and be sure that they were going to follow it. My piece of advice would be stop apologizing.
Well, in fairness to the critics of Israeli policy, let's flip over to that side. Every general knows, every first-year cadet at West Point knows that the purpose of winning a war is to effect a political change. Okay? Everybody knows that. And yet the tragedy of Israeli society is, despite over 60 years winning multiple wars, they haven't been able to effect a permanent political change. And critics of Israel would call them a police state. They would say that they're oppressing, they're occupiers. How would you respond to those people?
You know, I think it's true that it's important, that you're absolutely right. You know, Clausewitz told us that war is politics by other means, but politics is also war by other means. And they're one long continuum of ways that states try to advance their national interests. And in Israel, there really has been, over several years, over several decades, a disconnect between what happens militarily and what happens politically, and I think this has really been the bane of Israel's existence on the international scene for a very long time. And so, you know, when we talk about what Israel's detractors say and how they try to characterize Israel falsely by using those kinds of pejorative terms that you just mentioned, I think that Israel's inability to connect military operations with political policies or national security policies, diplomatic policies, has really resulted in Israel's enemies being able to gain the initiative in terms of being able to define what Israel is, even though those kinds of definitions have really no relationship whatsoever to the reality on the ground, or to that matter, or for that matter, to things like international law and things that as they actually are in reality.
But you would agree with me, Carolyn, that Israel needs, not wants, needs at some point to expand its success in the international public relations arena. They have to make people understand what's happening in Israel, and that they may or may not be the bad guy, but if they say they're not the bad guy, they have to have somebody in the world believe it. Would you agree with that?
Sure.
Okay, so what do they have to do to enhance their public image? We all have a public image. I have one, you have one. We want it to be as shiny as possible. And when people criticize Israel, we've often heard it said, to speak candidly, well, this is just a reflection of another form of anti-Semitism. But the people who criticize them, no, I'm not against Jews, but it's just that whatever those Israelis are doing is just bad.
Right.
Comment on that.
So it's always interesting that, you know, the whole point of anti-Semites is that, again, you know, they try to take away from Jews our ability to define who we are. You know, Jews have always defined ourselves since the dawn of Judaism 4,000 years ago as the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That has always been we were the first nation to ever give ourselves a definition, to say this is what we are, the first one to ever had self-determination, that we determined who we were at Mount Sinai, and before that, that we were the bearers of Moses' law, and that we were the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so from the very beginning, the role that anti-Semites have taken is, or the goal that they have set for themselves is the goal of preventing Jews from continuing to define who we are, and instead telling us who we are, and always doing it, of course, in a way that works to our disadvantage. And with the case of people who are trying to delegitimize Israel and say Israel is this and not that, and that you can't say, Carolyn Glick, what Zionism is or what Israel is, you know, they say that they're not anti-Semites, which may or may not be true on an individual level with individual interactions with individual Jews. But what they are is doing something, replicating the age-old behavior of anti-Semites by saying Jews are allowed to do this. Israel, in this case, as a collective Jew, is not allowed to do this, and using double standards and false statements to try to encapsulate Israel in a false narrative that then Israel, as a collective Jew, is unable to extricate itself from. And so, you know, that's the basic, I think, connection between anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, and anti-Semitism, that in both cases they're trying to take away from the Jews the right to define who we are.
There are smart people in this valley. They're smart people, okay, who write letters to the editor continuously, highly critical of Israeli policies, especially with a theme of this oppression of the Palestinians. And these aren't ill-educated people. They're not. They firmly believe that Israel is somehow violating the civil rights of these disenfranchised Palestinians. How would you respond to that?
So first of all, I would say that they're wrong. I mean, first and foremost, this is not true. The Palestinians as a collective in both Judea and Samaria and in Gaza, as well as the Arab citizens of Israel, have more rights as individuals than Arabs do anywhere else in the world. But beyond that...
Let's just repeat that for our viewers. Arabs living in Israel have more rights than Arabs in any other country, just about.
Yes, and more than that, in the areas that are ruled by the Palestinian Authority or in Gaza by Hamas's Palestinian Authority, these are areas that Israel has not controlled since 1994 or later 1996 at the latest. So Israel has had absolutely no authority over Palestinians since then. So any constriction of individual liberties that they've seen over the past 16 or 14 years, depending on where they live, is totally a consequence of the restriction of personal liberties that has been undertaken by the Palestinian Authority, both that run by Fatah, the Arafat's organization, the PLO, and those who live under Hamas rule in Gaza. So that Israel has not actually had so-called occupation of these areas since the mid-90s, and they have not had, and Israel has not had, as a consequence, any a responsibility for ensuring or guaranteeing or enabling the personal liberties of any of these people. So, again, so many of the statements that are made about Israel by otherwise intelligent people here in the Valley and throughout the world are based upon falsehoods.
Well, I think a lot of it's, in fairness, are based upon the obvious, which is that Israel is this incredibly successful, vibrant country surrounded by failed societies. Right. So isn't it a little bit like everybody is sort of a little bit envious of the rich uncle who did better than everyone else and thinks that somehow he did this unfairly or he did something wrong, and we would be in his situation had he not exploited the family?
Well, it's interesting. People should really pick up a terrific book called The Israel Test. And in that book, written by my friend George, who, because I'm on television, I suddenly can't remember his last name, and I'm really embarrassed, but it's The Israel Test, George Gilder, who's an extraordinary writer. He writes a lot about economic stuff here in the United States, mainly. And in The Israel Test, George gave me the compliment of quoting me on page 2, where we were sitting together at a conference in Toronto several years ago, and in my presentation that evening I explained that I divide the world into 2 categories based upon how they respond to success. And on the one side you have people who admire people who are successful, and really the United States was based upon that whole notion.
Isn't there a great deal of resentment for the United States from around the world for a similar reason?
Exactly. So you have the United States that was really built upon this idea of letting people go forward and break through borders and move on, and you were tested by your own capacity to succeed, and people admired successes. And then the other half of the world are people who envy success and try to cut down people who are successful rather than use their successes as a means to succeed on their own or as an inspiration. And I find really that the people who admire success admire Israel, and the people who envy success really tend to hate Israel quite a bit.
How much, speaking about what's going on in the world now from the perspective of Americans, okay, we're fighting a war on terror, whether people agree with that or not. How much of what that war on terror is a clash of cultures, and how much is it just this same old clash of religions that's been going on since the Crusades?
I think that this is very much a clash of civilizations or cultures or values, because it's not, it's a misnomer to call it a war on terror. What it is a war on jihad. And jihad is a tenet of Islam.
Explain jihad.
Jihad is a tenet of Islam that calls for expanding the Dars al-Islam, or the world of Islam, at the expense of what's called the Dars al-Harb, or the world of war. Because any place that isn't ruled by Islam, according to the Quran, is a place for Islam to then expand and go to war against, to subjugate and also to subjugate those who were not Muslims and to convert by the sword. And this is, you know, this is a tenet of the Quran. Now, it's been interpreted various ways, whether it's a struggle, an internal struggle to try to make myself better as a Muslim. But the fact of the matter is that the way that Muhammad carried out this tenet of his own religion was to gain strength and then conquer the areas that were ruled by non-Muslims and to subjugate and convert by the tip of the sword. And so jihad, as we see it in the versions of Al-Qaeda and the various Muslim Brotherhood organizations and Hamas, is really the classical definition of jihad, which is to expand the control of Islam by the sword over the world. And at the core of it, what we see, especially playing out in places like Israel, which is a front line of the jihad's war against the West as the only non-Islamic enclave from the Mediterranean to India, is we see the values that we're looking at are really completely opposite of ours. You know, however somebody turns on the abortion debate, everybody is clear that life is sacred inherently. Life in and of itself is a sacred entity, and that you have to do everything that you can to prolong and safeguard it. But on the other hand, the jihadists say that life is just an instrument to be used on the path to paradise, which is not of this world, but rather in heaven, and that the rewards that an individual should seek in his life are not rewards that he's going to find on earth, but rather in heaven. So you have, on the one side, people who sanctify life, and on the other hand, you have people who sanctify death. And in fact, the leaders of Hamas have said that they will destroy the Jews because the Jews sanctify life and they sanctify death, and therefore, by their interpretation of life and of war, they're stronger than the Jews because we're going to do everything we can to protect ourselves. You talked about Gilad Shalit, the IDF sergeant who's been held hostage now for 4 years, and what lengths Israel is willing to go to release him. The Hamas, as Sheikh Yassin, the head of Hamas, who was killed by Israel in 2004, said that it is because Israel will do so much, go to such extraordinary lengths to free a hostage, that they're going to defeat us.
Do most Israelis support a two-state solution?
Most Israelis really want peace. I mean, that's the thing that is crazy about the narrative, that it's sort of like...
Right, the warlike Israel wants to expand, take over territories. You know, of course, when the West Bank was under Jordanian control for 40 years before the '67 war, there was never any discussion of making it into a Palestinian state.
No, Jordan is the Palestinian
exactly.
state.
Right. Explain that basically when there was a partition of Palestine, it was divided into a Jewish and an Arab state, and one was Transjordan and became Jordan, and one was Israel. The tiny little mosquito-infested place.
Yes, it's an important little historical tidbit about international law that people like to overlook. So here's the deal, that in 1922, there was a conference in San Remo in Italy, where the the Allied powers in World War I got together and tried to decide what to do with the Ottoman Empire of Turkey that had just been dismantled in war. And so what they decided was that the area called Greater Syria under the Ottoman Empire, which included what is today Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Israel, including the West Bank, was all going to be divided, so that Syria and Lebanon were two different countries that were going to be overseen by the French, and then what became Palestine, which was the Roman term for the land of Israel, was to be given to Israel. And that included both sides of the Jordan River, both Jordan and what we have today is Israel and the West Bank. And that was then ratified as part of the mandate of Palestine that was given to the British to oversee. They had this whole area that went all the way to Iraq, that was supposed to be used and cultivated as a Jewish homeland. And then in 1924, in abrogation of their own commitments to the law of nations, the British decided that they were going to carve off the majority of that geographical landmass and give it to the Arabs, and they turned it into Transjordan, and they gave it to the Hashemites, who had been thrown out of Iraq and then out of Syria.
Hashemite kingdom was Jordanians.
Right. They're not. So they're originally Iraqis. They were in charge actually of Mecca and Medina. They were thrown out of there by the Sauds, and then it's this whole rigmarole.
But basically, the long story, there already is a Palestinian state. It's called
Right.
Jordan.
The majority of the people
Yes.
who live in Jordan are actually Palestinians.
Yes, so we're sort of looking to divide the pie again.
Right.
Okay, let's talk about Netanyahu.
Okay.
Is he the right man for the job?
He is the man who has the job.
Good answer. What can he do better?
Well, again, I think he should stop apologizing. Just not to beat a dead horse, but let's beat a dead horse and say he should stop apologizing too.
Okay, what has he done wrong, do you think?
Well, I think that he's done a pretty good job since he took office, but I think that he's been continuing on the road that we started paving. Some would say in 1993, others would say already in 1974, of unreciprocated Israeli concessions to people who are not willing to live at peace with us. And he made a freeze. The Obama administration pressured him to prohibit Jews from any building in Judea and Samaria, and also then they expanded the demand to Jerusalem. And this is, a demand that wouldn't pass muster anywhere in the world. It's saying that because you're Jewish, you have no right to your property, you can't develop it, you can't build it, just because you're Jewish. And that was the demand that President Obama made to Netanyahu just right after he came into office, and was really absolutely insistent on this. And most people in Israel really were offended by this demand because it is so prejudicial and bigoted towards Jews. And I mean, this is private property. This is owned by people. They own plots of land. And the U.S. government came down and said, because you're Jewish, even though you own this land, even though you already have a contract with a contractor to build your home on this land, you're Jewish, you're not allowed to.
Well, let's just talk about President Obama for a minute, because that's a good segue. I think it's fair to say that since the inception of the State of Israel, the United States has been, four square behind the State of Israel, and has always lent both our military, economic, and emotional support.
Well, with some notable exceptions. But
with some exceptions, but by and large, as a rule, I think President Obama, it's fairly clear that he's trying to chart a new course. I think he may believe that the course to peace may be in withdrawing some of this historic, traditional support for the State of Israel and trying to appear more of a neutral broker with its Arab neighbors. How would you respond?
I think that reality and what he's been doing in the 18 months since he took office would really bear out that statement that you just made. And, you were talking about people who are pretty smart, and they write these letters to the editors saying, Israel's at fault, Israel's at fault. And there has been this anti-Israel narrative that has taken over much of the discussion in the public discourse in the Western world, and the United States included, about Israel. And that false discourse, and we were talking a little bit about jihad before, and what it really is about, is based on papering over, hiding the reality of the forces that are warring against the United States, as we saw on September 11th and subsequent to that, and against Israel, and against Europe, and against India, as we saw with the Mumbai attacks in 2008, and on and on and on. And they're trying to hide the reality of what that is, and limiting discussion to really, irrelevancies like, are Jews building or placing mobile homes on, and so President Obama, where does he come into this discussion, is that he really seems to have bought into that false narrative about reality, and saying that, if I want to advance the cause of peace in the Middle East, that really the only actor that I should be pressuring is Israel, and everybody else should be left off the hook.
Is it possible that he could be right?
No, it's not possible that he could be right. We've been trying this idea now for decades, and every single time it's blown up in our faces.
For those who would criticize Israel and say you need to make peace, who would you ask them that we should negotiate with?
Precisely.
Well, explain that.
Well, here's the thing. The Palestinians today, in 2006, they had democratic elections. And the Palestinians democratically elected Hamas, which is an openly genocidal jihadist movement that is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which also spawned Al-Qaeda. And they chose them to rule themselves. And, the United States responded to that basically by ignoring what the Palestinians had just done, and then pushing money onto Fatah, the PLO terrorist organization that had just been defeated. And Fatah, let's be clear, was defeated for two reasons. One is because they were deeply corrupt and they developed a kleptocracy in the areas that Israel ceded to their authority in 1994. But they are also a terrorist organization. And one of the things that this false media discourse that we're suffering from for so many years has hidden from us is that in the Palestinian terror war against Israel that started in 2000, after the Palestinians refused statehood that was offered them at Camp David, until Israel finally defeated them more or less in 2004, 2005, the majority of terrorist attacks that killed Jews, that killed Israelis, Arabs and Jews actually, were carried out by Fatah, not by Hamas. I mean, this is a serious terrorist organization.
Which is more dangerous, Hezbollah or Hamas?
No, Iran. Iran
is Hezbollah. They support Hezbollah.
Iran is Hezbollah, but it's now also Hamas. Hamas has also become a proxy army of Iran, and Syria is a proxy state of Iran. And increasingly, you see, all the militias in Iraq today are run by Iran. So
did Jimmy Carter cause all these problems by withdrawing support of the Shah?
There is an argument to be made on behalf of that statement. That is a pretty strong argument that, yes, a lot of this is the fault of the Carter administration.
And ironically, he's become a very big critic of Israel.
You think that's ironic?
Well,
I don't think it's ironic at all.
Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We want to talk about Iran. We want to talk about Iraq. Let's take another short break. When we come back, we are going to find out whether the war in Iraq has changed things for the better. We're going to find out what's going on in Afghanistan, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Iranian bomb. We'll come right back. Jerry Bovino, welcome back. We've got Carolyn Glick, author of Shackled Warrior, and also the managing editor of the Jerusalem Post. Is that close enough?
It's basically right.
And this is the longest title I've ever heard. The Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Center for Security Policy in Washington. It's like, who made that title up?
I don't know. It wasn't a copywriter, I tell you what.
What? It wasn't a copywriter, because we like everything in 2 or 3 words, little sound bites. So let's move on a little bit. We talked a little bit about Israel. We didn't talk about Israeli society. Most people who aren't familiar with Israel might think Israel is all religious Jews, Orthodox Jews. Explain what the difference is between religious Jews and secular Jews in Israel, and how that relates to Israeli political policy.
Well, the truth of the matter is that I think Orthodox Jews are great. I'm all for Orthodox Judaism and everything like that. But Israel is an open, pluralistic society. We have all kinds of different people who live in Israel. And, you have Orthodox Jews and you have less observant Jews, traditional Jews, Reform Jews, conservative Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, all the different sects of ultra-Orthodox Judaism. I mean, you could get dizzy just trying to figure out how many different kinds of Jews there are. And then, there are a lot of different non-Jews in Israel. It's not all just like the Arabs are many different groups. There are Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs. There are Druze. There are all kinds of. And the
truth of it is that Israel is one of the most self-examining societies in the world.
Sure is.
And you can get up. You have free speech, as opposed to in most Arab countries. You can get up, free speech, freedom of religion. You can be a Christian in Israel. You can be a Muslim in Israel, and you have freedom of speech and religion and things that you don't have in most other non-Western countries.
You don't have anywhere else in the Middle East.
No, nowhere else in the Middle East. If you're a Christian in Saudi Arabia, can you openly go to church? And
God help you, there are no churches.
There are no churches.
You're not even allowed to have a Bible there. If you have a Bible, it'll be confiscated, and you may likely be thrown into jail.
And the Arabs who live in Israel
have forget about the women in Saudi.
Forget about the women. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what? If you're an Arab who lives in Israel, you have a political party.
You have lots of political parties.
You're represented. The oldest joke about the people have been trying to kill the Jews for thousands of years, and the oldest joke is if they just leave them alone for 2 generations, they'd kill each other.
Well, there you have
and
it.
Because it's a very self-examining society, and that's always searching for the truth.
Not to mention argumentative. But look, the Arabs, maybe they take after the Jews. I don't know.
Well,
they take up 20% of the population.
Cousins,
they have
right?
and they have 5 different political parties. Amongst them, they don't even speak to one another very often.
How much of what we're seeing in this global Islamic expansion is a one-off thing that doesn't relate to the average Muslim who I think wants to live in peace, doesn't want it. Most Muslims, even in Iran, aren't radical Islamists. How much of this is driven by a few select mullahs who want to drive the world in their direction?
I think Iran is an interesting case because you find in Iran that the people who have been living under an Islamic theocracy since 1979, the majority of the people of Iran desperately want to overthrow their regime, and we see
the majority
this every day.
do, and we know that. The CIA can tell us that.
Everybody can tell you that. It's just a question of whether the Western world, the free world, is going to step up to the plate and help these people or not. But when you talk about the Muslim world, the problem that I have with the statement, the vast majority of Muslims feel this way or that way, is that the loudest voice that we're hearing out of the Muslim world, whether it represents a majority or a minority, is immaterial for this purpose. But the loudest voice that we're hearing, not only emanating from places like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and all the different Muslim satellite stations or pan-Islamic satellite stations that are crowding the airwaves, is that the voice that we're hearing is the voice of radical Islam. And unfortunately, whether they're the majority or the minority, whether they're a plurality or whether they're whatever, we're not hearing competing voices, not in the West.
But don't the extremists on both ends of the political spectrum always have the podium and the microphone? There's nothing unusual about that. How often does a nice moderate person get up and make his, even in America?
No, you're right, but the moderates stand up when they feel that their way of life is being
But we have
threatened.
Egypt, which has made peace with Israel. Jordan and Egypt are 2 moderate Arab countries, but have they stepped up to the plate to voice a moderate position?
No, they haven't. And really what's very disturbing about that is that what we find is that Israel has made cold peaces with regimes. They're both autocracies.
Cold peaces.
Cold peace.
Define a cold peace.
A cold peace is a peace where basically what you have is a prolonged ceasefire. But if you look at the Egyptian order of battle, and you look at the exercises that they carry out, the Egyptian military every single year, the foe that they're fighting is an unnamed country to the north of Egypt, i.e. Israel. So they're still preparing for war against Israel. And the Egyptian regime has never opened up the debate to anybody other than these extremists, so that the only people who have freedom of speech in Egypt actually are the radical Islamists who preach the genocide of world Jewry, who preach the destruction of the United States, and by the way also preach the destruction of the Egyptian regime. So unfortunately what Israel has made are cold peaces or extended ceasefires with Egypt, the regime in Egypt, and with the regime in Jordan. But when you look at opinion polling data, you find that the overwhelming majority, that is upwards of 90% of the Egyptians and of the Jordanians, reject Israel, reject Israel's right to exist, reject Jewish right to national home, and really hate Jews. And it's a big problem.
How much of the problem that we have in moving toward peace, Carolyn, how much of that is tied to this 1947 concept that we're going to drive the Jews into the sea and take back this country for ourselves? How important is it for the Arab world to recognize the right of Israel to exist before we can ever really have peace?
That is the sine qua non. That is the basic foundation of everything. And by the way, all these UN Security Council resolutions are based upon that precept, that if you look at the resolutions, you see that they say, first, Israel must be accepted with secure borders. And then we can talk about land swaps here, land swaps there. Maybe Israel should give some land. Maybe they should give some land. It doesn't even say. But the point is that everything has to be predicated first and foremost on the Arab world's acceptance of Israel's right to exist. And what we find is that there has been no fundamental acceptance by any significant number, politically significant number, of Arabs in the region. And in fact, what we've seen is that the more that we talk about peace and the more pressure is brought to bear on Israel to cough up land to the Arabs, whether it's the Syrians or the Palestinians or what have you, the less willingness we see on the part of the Arab world to accept Israel's right to exist. The more stressed Israel becomes by the West and by the UN, by the US government, by the European Union, the more the Arabs writ large, and I don't like to talk about 300 million or 1 billion, however you want to count, people as a collective. But we do see very clear trends, which is that the more Israel is attacked, the more people in that world, in the Islamic world, in the Arab countries surrounding Israel, become convinced that Israel will be destroyed.
Because you have 300 million people and dozens of countries surrounding one tiny
22.
country with 6 or 8 million people. How many people live in
7
Israel?
million.
7 million people. And you can understand their frustration, just trying to have a little empathy for them, that they've been trying to kill these people since time immemorial, and they just can't do it.
Right. So as a Jewish mom, I can tell you I have no sympathy for people who want to throw me into the sea. I just can't see their way of thinking. It's really impossible. I take it personally.
There's an expression in Israel, amongst Israelis, only one bomb wide. Explain that.
Yeah, we're, you have a one horse town and we're a one bomb country because really we have, for various reasons, pathologies of the British mandate where they allowed Jews to buy land. You have the overwhelming majority of Israelis, 80% of Israelis living in a very small coastal plain between Haifa and Gadara, and one nuclear bomb with a sizable payload, or even a medium-sized payload, can really destroy the country.
Well, let's talk about the bomb, because it seems pretty obvious and doesn't seem like anybody's doing anything to stop it, that Iran has got their centrifuges and they're spinning as we talk, and they're going to enrich uranium and make a nuclear weapon. If they don't have one already, they'll probably have it maybe this year or next year. What should the world do about this? What should the United States do, and what should Israel do?
Just like I don't like to talk about a collective of Arabs, the Arabs. I don't like to talk about the world, because you really have to kind of narrow it down what you're talking about.
Okay, let's talk about the United States first.
The United States should either carry out or support Israel carrying out a military operation that's aim is to destroy Iran's
Can they
nuclear
do that? They have the
installations.
bunker-busting bombs, but apparently these centrifuges and things are spread around the country.
Right.
It's not going to be as easy as it was in Baghdad.
No, that was a one-off in 1981 when Israel destroyed the French-built reactor that Saddam Hussein had put together, Osirak.
And the world, by the way, breathed a sigh of relief at the time. They were happy that Israel did it.
Actually, no, the world condemned it.
They condemned it.
They pretty much
condemned
Israel.
it publicly, but under the sheets, they were happy that Saddam didn't have a bomb.
Dick Cheney, who was the former vice president, was the defense secretary during the Gulf War in '91, and he said to Israel's ambassador to Washington later on that the United States would never have been able to eject Saddam Hussein from Kuwait and fight that war if Israel hadn't bombed, which shows really how absolutely critical a strong Israel is to U.S. national security. Because, one of the main things that the United States has to do is an unchanging national security interest of the United States is a free flow of inexpensive petroleum products in the Persian Gulf, and Israel enabled that by bombing the Osirak reactor.
Harry Truman said there would be no problem in the Middle East if it weren't for a 3-letter dirty word, oil. How much is the conflict in the Middle East about oil?
Oh, it's so about oil.
It's all about oil.
Well, no, it's got other components too, but oil it has a majority share.
But you know what Renoir said to Van Gogh?
No.
Show me the Monet. And in this case, the Monet is oil. And the world wants that oil, and the people who control that oil will ultimately gain both economic, political, and military power.
Well, yes. That's right. I'm still stuck with that horrible joke you just told. But yes, you're absolutely right.
Even a broken clock is right twice a day. That wasn't my moment.
And Manet was Jewish, by the way.
Who was?
Manet, Edward Manet.
Manet? No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was. But anyway, little piece of trivia.
Yeah. So let's go on then. So would Israel be justified? Suppose the United States takes a standoff policy. Oh, we don't want to know. We don't look. There's no bomb. It couldn't, like a Jackie Mason routine. It could have been a bomb, but it wasn't a bomb. We didn't think it was going to be a bomb.
Right.
And the United States just stands back. And Obama seems like he's inclined that way, at least in public right now. Would the Israelis be justified in taking this matter into their own hands in the name of their national security?
Absolutely. You have My ideal situation would be a joint U.S.-Israeli assault on Iran's nuclear installations, and by the way, on the Revolutionary Guards installations throughout Iran, in order to help the Iranian people overthrow the regime, which I think is the long-term solution here, is to overthrow the Iranian regime. I think we'll see a lot of closure in a lot of different places, including Iraq and Afghanistan.
Is the CIA trying to affect, in your judgment, I know they don't call you personally and tell you, but in your judgment, is the CIA trying to affect a warlike change in Iran right now? Are they supporting the moderates?
No, all evidence to the contrary, and it's not moderates. These are people who are pro-democracy, who believe in individual liberties, who want to have democracy, real democracy, not one man, one vote, one time, but real representational democracy in Iran, and who hate jihadist Islam. They want to stop it. They want to have, and were they to take over, we would see things like Hezbollah in Lebanon just shrivel up and die, because that is an Iranian organization. We would see Hamas weakened. We would see the Assad regime in Syria either overthrown or so weakened that they weren't able to threaten anybody anymore. I mean, we would see the Iraqi people being able to finally do what the United States has spent so much blood and money trying to effect in that country, which is develop and maintain a representational democracy in that crucial country. And we would see also the Afghans being able to get their act in gear and stop being threatened all the time by Taliban.
Which Arab countries have actually affected working democracies?
Well, Iraq is the first one to try. I mean, Lebanon had one sort of in the past until the PLO took over the country.
But the Lebanese Christians were sort of running the country at that point.
Well, at that time they were also the majority. It's just that since the PLO essentially invaded Lebanon in the early 1970s after they were thrown out of Jordan, they caused so much terror. They terrorized the Lebanese Christian population to such a degree that now you have massive minority populations of Lebanese Christians in the Western world and South America, but they have become a minority in Lebanon. They were classically the majority, but this is, again, sort of a textbook case of jihadist expansionism, of trying to subjugate and throw out non-Islamic elements from a society.
Well, why has it been so hard to establish democracies in Islamic countries?
Look, first of all, I think that's a question that has to be always directed towards Muslims themselves. Why is it that you are willing to live under these dictatorships, and why is it that when you are given the freedom to express yourself, what you're really expressing is this, hateful Muslim Brotherhood type of rhetoric that calls for the annihilation of the Jewish people and the subjugation of the Western world? Why is that? What's going on? And I think that because of oil, a lot of dirty deals have been made with dictators that say, okay, you keep giving us cheap oil and we're going to let you run your own country. And what President Bush said after 9/11, in a moment of real strategic clarity, he said...
You're talking about W. Bush the second.
Exactly. Yeah. He made a very clear statement. He said, we have made a dirty bargain. He recognized this, and he said, and it doesn't work. What the felling of the Twin Towers and the attack on the Pentagon and wherever Flight 93 would have ended up going if it hadn't been for those brave passengers on board showed very clearly is that bargain that may have brought rewards, particularly to oil companies in the United States, but in general to American oil consumers for several decades. That bargain no longer holds, because what the United States trusted the Saudis and the rest of them to do, they didn't uphold that end of the bargain. Instead of making sure that their population was pacific, was peaceful, what they did was they enabled this Islamic genie out of the bottle, and what has really come a cropper is extraordinary hate and dangerous values that, again, sanctify death, not life, and have as their goal the destruction of everything that we, as Westerners, as people who live in democracies, as people who value freedom and life, hold dear.
Let's talk a little bit about Afghanistan. I think it's an important subject because President Obama, in the midst of criticism from many in his own party, has expanded the war in Afghanistan. He's increased the number of troops. And it's fair to say, preface your remarks by saying that no country in the history of the world,
No.
let me go back to like biblical times, has ever won a war in Afghanistan. Why can we win a war in Afghanistan, and is American policy, in your judgment, misdirected?
No, I think that the problem is that people are expecting something to happen. That's very difficult to affect. I think, we have to remember, why did America go into Afghanistan? America went into Afghanistan because under the Taliban, Al-Qaeda was able to plot and carry out the 9/11 attack against the United States. And so the United States went in there to overthrow the Taliban regime and to defeat Al-Qaeda, destroy their operation center in Afghanistan. Now, so they did that in October, November of 2001. Why has the United States maintained and NATO maintained their military presence in that country ever since? And the reason is because they want to make sure that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which by the way are really just two sides of the same coin, you can't divide them, that they don't reassert control over that country, so that they're not able to use that country again as a means for attacking the United States. And we saw, by the way, with the attempted attack in Times Square and in other attacks in the United States, that these elements, whether they're in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, continue to foment violence against the United States from their safe haven. So the point of U.S. and NATO presence in Afghanistan is not, God willing, they'll all become, like the Virginians, right, with like the Madisonian Democrats. But the point is to maintain a position where the Taliban is not able to return to power.
But isn't President Obama's policy to support, and speaking candidly, and I don't want to be critical of the president, but this is exactly what many of us were concerned about. He's supporting another corrupt, the Karzai regime in Afghanistan is another corrupt regime that I don't really think represents the Afghani people. We're supporting another corrupt dictator in a different form. Let's be honest.
Well, again, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. When you talk about Karzai, warts and all, he is not Mullah Omar.
He's the best we have.
He's not Mullah Omar.
Okay.
And, let's just be clear, to quote the president, let's be clear about what we have going here. We're not talking about an ideal form of government breaking out in Afghanistan tomorrow. What we're talking about is an operation that is based on a campaign whose goal is to prevent Mullah Omar from coming back.
We're going to have to do a wrap. I want to really thank Carolyn B. Glick, the author of Shackled Warrior. She's a speaker at the Conflict and Conscience seminar, which will be Thursday the 15th. And Carolyn, hope you have a good time in Aspen. I hope you get to hike. I took away our hiking time today. We'll see you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.